question that's just dropped into the top of my brain there is, how significant do we think the framing of capitalism or having been, I suppose, formed by Marx's take on it, has been for what we now see as commercial society? So where I'm going with this is, we've talked about how pre-industrial revolution in England, we had a highly commercial society. We had lots of tinkerers and people trying to figure out a problem to be able to help them and their own individual endeavors. They would occasionally share what's going on within societies that they'd set up. It was civil society. It was an emergent property. It wasn't a top-down thing.
No.
Yet, what I notice is capitalism now is so heavily infused with state activity, insofar as it is directed, whether it's by regulators, whether it's by supranational bodies. And I can't help but think, if I think about the likes of Marx and Engels, and then a lot of their followers since, is that most of the time it serves to be able to view capitalism in their way, because it's about trying to, that full social history, this one of, let's return it back to collective ownership. Well, in England, we can see that just never existed. And so, and even if the collective ownership existed that they're supposing is about at a family level or a community level, is what they're proposing is that it ends up being held at the state level. And so then you end up with states directing things and then all of the various side actors. So I guess the question is if there was a change in the understanding of capitalism, which, not utopian enough to think there will be, do you think that would change our approach to this heavily regulated, top-down signaling world that we live in?
Yes, absolutely. People are used to thinking it as a system, as a unified system. And because if it's a unified system, the system can be managed and run and organized, right? There's a reason why Adam Smith was not very keen on the man of system, right? He thought that was a mistaken way of thinking about social and human action. And if you see it as commercial society, right, that's people acting in certain ways, but it's not a unified system in the same sense, right? And it's also clearly not intimately interactive with the state. The state may help it, the state may hinder it. The state may be helping them, the state may be getting in the way. And when you look at commerce around the world, the relationship between commerce and the state is very, very complex. I mean, there's a lot of societies where there's a lot of state commercial action which tries to avoid the state as much as possible. I mean, it tries to hide itself from the state. And that's usually a sign that you've got a pretty dysfunctional state. I mean, Latin America and Africa, there's a lot of that. And the more dysfunctional bits of Asia, there's lots of that. But I'll give you a really practical modern example of where it's a system thinking goes wrong. And that is the commercial development of China, right? So people say Deng Xiaoping did this thing. That's not what happened. What happened is, in the Cultural Revolution, there was such a churn and such disorganization of the Communist Party, because remember, Mao is using various levers to churn over the Communist Party to break up people who are opposing his will in the system, right? So he uses the Red Guard against the Communist Party, then he uses the military against the Communist Party. And the Communist Party lost a lot of its penetration into the countryside because of this churn and disorganization and so forth. So villagers started doing their own thing. And it's clear when you start looking at the records that even at the height of the Cultural Revolution, there was still a lot of commerce going on. How can we tell? All the people being charged with engaging in commerce, right? They were constantly charging people for engaging in commerce. So what that tells us is there was a lot of commerce going on, right? And what happened is villagers started just saying, We hate collectivization. We're all agreeing to redivide the land and we'll have our own farms and we'll just quietly get together and pay the state, right? And after a while, and you start getting this commerce bubbling up, and then local officials began to sort of let it run. And basically what happened is Deng Xiaoping was smart enough to go, oh, this seems to be working. Let's just see how this runs, right? And part of what was going on is we think of Deng as the sort of dominant leader of China. He was the most important figure, but he wasn't as dominant as people thought he was, outsiders thought he was. And in fact, the CCP itself was divided. And because it was divided, this also gave more capacity for people at the lower level to do their own thing. And the guy who, I think his name was Chen Yun, who was Deng's rival, was more of an old-style Marxist. But what they had in common was a large dose of Chinese pragmatism, right? And they were both pragmatic at the basic operational level, even though they were both Marxist, Leninist, Maoists, right? And these factors all came together. And over time, what evolved was an interaction between party, state, and local action that led this commerce to start bubbling up and bubbling up and bubbling up. And after a while, particularly after he went to Japan and saw how productive East Asians could be if you stopped getting in their way, and then American back, right? They went with it. Now, there was all sorts of ups and downs, but that's how you get a commercial turn in a society that's theoretically Marxist-Leninist and which doesn't actually legalize commerce at any sort of serious level in 2004, right? It's been running seriously since 1978. Okay, now this also, I have to go, gets in the way of all those things about, well, you've got to have secure property rights. Yeah, yes and no. They obviously found a very Chinese way to have functional property rights, even though they weren't actually legal. And this that complicated relationship between commerce and the state. Now, if you think of it as capitalism and as what Deng Xiaoping did, you're actually getting the story really, really fundamentally wrong. And so, yes, and another way it misleads, this idea of capitalism, it's the ownership of capital is crucial, it's all top down, is, as I alluded to earlier, people get the way the Western empires worked and how you understand the Western empires work, basically because they trying to put it into a capitalist mode. And you think to yourself, well, that's not right, because there have always been, as soon as you have states, you have empires, and these you wouldn't call, Sargon of Akkad's empire capitalist, but it's clearly an empire, right? And so on and so on and so forth. So yes, the terminology gets in the way. It forces people to think about it as a unified system when it's not. It way overemphasizes the importance of capital. It way underemphasizes risk management, discovery, coordination. It way underestimates the way it is a process in a society of networks. And commerce is just something that people keep doing, right? We used to wonder how the Soviet Union could make itself functional. I mean, it didn't, of course, but to the extent that it did, a lot of that was black markets. So it was hidden commerce, and we say, oh, that's all criminal. Yeah, it actually allowed the system to get around some of its own stupidities because people would trade illegally, but they would trade in a way that make things function, where if they were just doing the proper Gosplan thing, well, more or less nothing would work. At least not for very long. So yes, unless, I'll rephrase that slightly differently. If you're Stalin and you're willing to shoot lots of people and everyone's terrified and you've got competing lines of information, you can sort of kind of make it work. But the minute it sort of starts regularizing and all the bureaucratic problems start coming about because you have regularized it, well, you get what you get. You get the slow, steady stagnation. But yes, so commerce is a thing people do. And if you lead them, they'll just do it.